We're here with Catherine O'Donnell. She is the author of Elizabeth Seton, American Saint, which discusses the life of Elizabeth Seton, who was an American Catholic in the early American Republic and during the Revolutionary War. So, Catherine, I'll let you take it away. I'm especially interested in, or I was wondering if you could give us sort of an overview of the book and of who Elizabeth Seton was and what sort of drove you to write this.
Absolutely. Elizabeth Seton is the first person born in what would become the United States to be made a saint in the Catholic Church. So she's part of that tradition. And if you look around the country, really, you'll see Mother Seton parishes and schools. She is also very much a woman of the age of revolutions and of the early American Republic. So she was born in 1774. She lived through the Revolution in New York City. As a young woman, she was very interested in contemporary philosophy, especially Rousseau. She married a merchant who struggled because of the Napoleonic era. She was not particularly interested in institutional Christianity when she was young, and then living in the late 18th century, she heard sort of Methodist hymns on the street. She became interested in Episcopalianism. And eventually, after a personal crisis, her husband went bankrupt and then he died. She converted to Catholicism and she founded the American Sisters of Charity. And that also is part of this long Catholic monastic tradition, but it's also one of a number of communities that spring up in the early 19th century in the United States, in which people live in a different way and seek a higher purpose. So I was drawn to her because she lives amidst these timelines and frameworks that are often kept separate, but which shouldn't be, and which really come together in her life and work.
And it's a really impressive, it struck me as a really impressive work of just history, especially in terms of how many documents you're able to assemble in order to put this together. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that process of assembly and what were a lot of the documents that you were using for this.
Absolutely. So saint making is archive making. That's not what it's for, but that is the result of it. So because people, even during Seton's lifetime and certainly thereafter, thought that she had something to offer the Catholic Church, they collected her papers. And what I then was able to use were hundreds, probably thousands of pages of letters she'd written, journals, letters to her, reflections, little tiny notes that were meant to be hidden that she sent to people right after her conversion. And there's also, receipts and all kinds of practical things. So you could kind of get a sense of her thought. Could also get a sense of the way she and other people began to shape her life into a story that could be told. And you also get a sense of kind of the hurly-burly that was part of her life that you might not expect of someone known for spirituality. But so, for example, I'd be reading these agonized spiritual reflections, and I would start to write a sort of piece about this tortured period of Elizabeth Seton's life that wasn't wrong, but then I'd realize there are hundreds of receipts that she was writing out and certificates of good behavior at the same time. So she's also very much sort of doing her work as she's undergoing these spiritual crises. So even the sort of juxtaposition of the documents sometimes was really revealing.
And was there, did you have a background working with like these documents before you decided to turn this into a book? Was there anything in particular that drove you to Elizabeth Seton and to this way of approaching the topic?
So in fact, the shortest answer is I did a postdoc at William & Mary, and I taught a little course, the early Republic through biography. And one of the students there said to me, "I'd like to write about Mother Seton." And this was years ago when I was still working on my first book. And I thought, what a great idea. And I was kind of startled to find that there were not a lot of scholarly treatments of her. I think that her her sainthood kind of repelled scholarship in a way. It just put her in a different category. And I felt that way at first myself. I had a background in the period and the revolutionary and early national periods. I was familiar with Catholic theology for a variety of reasons. But I had to kind of convince myself that you could write a biography that wasn't a hagiography of a saint. And then the archive itself was so rich that she was knowable through that evidence, right? Through the kind of documents we use as historians. And so that's what convinced me to go ahead with the project.
Yeah, that touches on a point that I thought was really interesting, which is, I mean, I was thinking about this idea of like historical causality and this like kind of very central problem for historians of really establishing cause and effect. And I think that there's an interesting tension in the book between your role as a historian and putting that narrative together in that way, as well as your subject of the book, Elizabeth Seton, and her like faith in this kind of divine being, God, who kind of takes that problem away completely. And I was wondering how you handled the presentation of that.
I worried about it constantly. That's how I handled it. It was very interesting to think about causality exactly as you say, in my world and in her world. And Elizabeth Seton did develop a somewhat providential sense of history. And I would take care to describe that in documents and certainly not give myself over to that in the documents. On the other hand, her sense of kind of the workings of divinity in the world made her do things, right? It had an effect on the world. And so it wasn't something I wanted to cordon off, right? I wanted that to appear as part of her reality, part of the reality of the people around her, but not part of my own explanations of things. So that was kind of a constant thing to think about. But I'll just also add that Seton herself is a child of the Enlightenment era. She also was interested in, for example, medical science. Her father was a really interesting kind of contrarian scientific physician. When people become sick, she actually doesn't pray for them to become better. That doesn't seem to be something that she feels an appropriate use of prayer. Instead, she turns to the medical science of the day. So although in some ways she felt that her own spiritual journey was the result of kind of grace that she was offered, she also very much shared a kind of 18th century, early 19th century sense that most of the things that happen in the world are things that people or sort of natural scientific elements do cause.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting too how you handled when you talk about her, like she had this huge tendency to kind of self-document her own life and her own faith as well. She has her Dear Remembrances, which is sort of her story of how she became a Catholic and her experience with that, and then also her commonplace book that she was keeping, which was fairly typical of the time. And I liked how you incorporated those to give a sense of who she was, but you also obviously didn't. You couched it in a certain way. You were able to contextualize it a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely tried to. Right. So the commonplace book comes out of her relationship with this really interesting father who had just very little interest in institutional Christianity, lots of interest in science and medicine. And she keeps these books with her, gives them to her daughters, even after she has set for herself that kind of intellectual world in the past. It's clear that she still values it. Dear Remembrances is really interesting. She actually considered burning her papers at a certain point because she knew she had loved Rousseau. And even by 1815, you weren't supposed to have loved Rousseau. It had nothing to do with being Catholic, right? He had become, along with Voltaire, sort of touchstone for things we'd rejected about the 1790s. she'd been very involved in Protestantism, and she wanted to sort of clear all that out. She was convinced not to, actually by a priest who wanted this record kept. But Dear Remembrances is her effort to create kind of a clearer path that would be useful to other people. And it's not a lie, but it's heavily curated. It makes her much less interesting than she was. And so to me, it was useful to present it as an example of her participation in the creation of her own story. Without actually using it as a good evidence base for me to tell about the actual facts of her life.
Are there any specific insights into Seton that you were able to draw from those sources, or from your incorporating them into the book?
Sure. She had a sense. What's really interesting to me in the documents in particular is the way she's kind of ablaze with certainty right after her conversion, and it's very sincere, and I also found it very off-putting, that moment of her life, because it's the one point at which she is convinced she knows how things should be done, and she really feels she has an obligation to explain to other people that my new faith, Catholicism, is the safest path to God. But she also, at that point of her conversion, kind of hints that she's chosen Catholicism in part because if you have to choose, the Catholic Church offers the kind of most terrifying vision of what happens if you choose wrong. So in a sort of subset of Pascal's wager, why not choose them? But she then kind of suppresses that. Later in her life, the documents make clear that she herself is kind of going back and coming to terms with how haphazard and imperfect that whole choice was. And she also completely rejects the idea of trying to persuade anyone else to believe anything. She is just then going to try to give people a very specific attention that comes out of her faith, but that doesn't demand anything doctrinally from them. And it was particularly interesting then to see someone who was so strong-willed and in many cases single-minded also change her mind about something so profoundly important to her, which was her obligation to spread her faith or not to spread her faith in certain ways. And so I was just so grateful that she didn't burn those documents, right? And that she did have this habit of self-recording that made that kind of twisty journey visible.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of the book, I think. Those chapters discussing her trip to Italy, where she becomes sort of acquainted with Catholicism, at least in a different way than she was used to, and then her waffling back and forth back in the U.S. Between, do I continue on this road or go back to the faith that I've sort of known? And I thought that, I liked it because of it showed this very personal side of her, and I think it was something that's very relatable as well to a lot of people. But also because it just brought in so many different strains of social issues, of political issues, and all of these different influences that I think reflected sort of the religious landscape in the U.S. at the time too, and dealing with this religious liberty that they had, and that they were trying to figure out what that really meant.
Yeah, I love that you read it that way. I mean, her life, she lived amidst choice, right? In New York and in that period. And you see that reflected everywhere, right? She can check out all kinds of books from the New York Society Library. She sees Quakers on the streets. She hears Methodist hymns. She attends an Episcopalian church. When she goes to Italy, in some sense, Catholicism is sort of the last thing someone of her cosmopolitan, genteel, Anglican background would be expected to adopt. But her openness to experience, right, her sense that, well, everything is worth trying, actually led her to try quiet. And then she was completely startled when she realized after a while that she did not feel herself to be a tourist, simply watching the goings on. She felt herself moved by this mass. And she kind of felt that Catholicism linked heaven and earth in a way that the Protestantism that she knew had not done. So great, she's made a choice, and yet that choice is incredibly painful to her and also to her family. So that religious liberty is this opportunity, but what happens if someone you love chooses differently, and then worries that you're left on the other side of this dangerous divide? It was sort of enormously painful. Silence was awkward. Talking was more awkward. And they were just kind of thrashing their way through. And there's a sort of tradition in the Catholic telling of the story that her family are simply prejudiced against Catholics, against the papists, right? And that sort of reads back a later history into that moment, and an older history actually forward into that moment. In fact, her family much of the time was simply saying, can we just please let this sit, right? Can we just please each do as we see fit? And it's actually a position that Seton herself did come to adopt, as I mentioned later on. But that pull between a desire for harmony in a diverse society, an embrace of liberty, and yet a feeling that maybe you should try to convince people of things, and then the heartbreak that results when you do, was really this very rich part of the story.
And it extends beyond her family as well. I thought it was interesting when she finally became a Catholic in New York, and just the ways that really impacted a lot of her relationships with like personal relationships with friends, as well as just her sort of standing in society, or the way that she was perceived in society more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, her family had done, the merchant side of the family had done business with some wealthy Catholics, but in general, as her sister put it, Catholics were the red-faced people, right, at St. Peter's Church. They simply weren't part of the circle. And Catholicism itself also seemed like a thing of the past, right? Why would you go backward? That's truly the way her family thought of it. And when some of the younger women in her orbit, these kind of half siblings of her husband that she had helped to raise, became interested in Catholicism, there's clearly a worry: how are they going to find husbands, right? How are they going to find their place in the world? And Seton's relatives were furious. She seemed to be risking their future by linking them to this religion that simply was not accepted by the society that she lived in. And one relative in particular later referred to her as the abbess, right? And just wrote with such rage and a sense of betrayal that she had kind of destroyed the family's good name by doing this. So it was this sort of stew of kind of personal hurt, social economic concerns, particularly, as I said, about these teenage girls, a kind of Anglo-American mistrust of Catholicism. But then what does reassert itself is this desire for harmony and a basic willingness to simply find a way that they can carry on in their different ways, without argument or tension, at least within this circle. But it took years to achieve that, and distance to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to pivot a little bit to talk about, I guess, another major idea that I found in the book is this, these notions of like domesticity, these notions of what a woman really could do at this time, especially, and these gender norms that Seton was breaking, but maybe not in a way that we would typically think of in terms of like 20th century 20th century feminism or something along those lines. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Right. She's the rebel who had taken a vow of obedience. I always love that about her. She was well educated. Her father, who at first kind of didn't see her particularly, he was caught up in her own career, realized when she was a teenager that of all his children, including all of his sons, she was the one who was most intellectually ambitious. And kindred to him in that way. So that she was allowed to pursue. And yet there was always a sense that this would enrich her mind, right? Perhaps enrich her children in the way we used to think of, right? As sort of Republican womanhood, but would not lead to a career in any sense. And there's no evidence that she objected to that. When her husband is going bankrupt, she actually becomes his quiet clerk and stays up all night, including when she's pregnant with her 5th child, doing the books. And yet after he dies, when there's a real need for money, there's no possibility of her finding work in a counting house, right? Not even with any in their circle. So there are those constraints. She works with the Poor Widows Society, which is a Protestant benevolent organization, before her conversion. And there she's the treasurer. So actually there, and this again is a story familiar to other women of the era, she is allowed to use her accounting skills, right, in this kind of benevolent way. But it's kind of in an interesting way, it is the sisterhood, right, the sort of apostolic tradition, which is a variant of the monastic tradition, which says to Catholic women, you can devote your life to something that is not conventional domesticity. And so not just Seton, but other women who joined her community have careers. And they found schools, they found orphanages. One of them, Rose White, who's this kind of fabulously prickly character, she is sent around to open up the new missions. It's something that she is clearly good at. This is all happening within a framework of obedience to clergy and of selflessness. And there are absolutely moments when there are governance issues that come out either over the way decisions are made or more commonly over kind of personal friction. What's the limits of the women's judgment versus a bishop's judgment or a priest's judgment? But to a great extent, she remakes her spiritual life. She moves her children. She creates a community. She makes important decisions about that community, such as that the school will accept Protestants as well as Catholics and won't try to proselytize them. And she sends other women off on these benevolent careers, all at a time when that kind of sustained work would seem highly, highly unlikely. She's not, of course, as a woman, able to do the sacramental labor of the church, right? That was and is reserved to clergy. And there are these really interesting moments. She one of her priests that she works with just cannot master the English language. He's French and he never quite gets it all. Most of them pick up languages very quickly. And she basically writes his sermons with him to some extent for him. He openly acknowledges it. And it's kind of an open secret that she is writing these sermons, but when he leaves, of course, her voice is silenced also, right? So that gendered architecture of the church gives her a real place to flower and also offers real constraints on what she can do.
And was there an extent to which as well that she was able to sort of navigate or create this world and this career for herself, partially because of her social class as well?
Absolutely, without question. Yes. She was well connected from birth. Even after her husband's bankruptcy, she was well connected. The Italian family immediately connected her to the wealthiest Catholics in New York and to Catholics in Boston. She presented herself in kind of a confident way. the very fact that she had been a Protestant and that she was the mother of 5 children appealed to Catholic clergy, especially these French Sulpicians who thought, aha, this is the face of the Catholic Church that we want. A well-educated, genteel, once wealthy, even if that wealth is gone, matron. And the kind of Catholic clans of Maryland, some of whom were enormously wealthy, many of whom had status, accepted her immediately. And Protestant families as well trusted her to raise their daughters in a way that would be conventionally genteel. So that's another part of her kind of mixed story of rebellion and subversiveness and risk-taking, all within this very respectable, genteel, apparently but deceptively docile kind of presentation.
And is there an extent to which she recognized that or acknowledged that in her writing?
Yeah, she recognized her, with one exception, which I'll turn to. I think she did recognize what we would call her privilege. It's interesting when she, even after her husband is bankrupt, she's working with the Poor Widows Society, and she makes a point of saying, I know nothing of the deprivation that these people do, right? I have, friends have given me a house and so forth. She embraces asceticism, and she understands that she's choosing it. And she does sincerely want to enable children who can't pay to go to her school. What she's blind to is the enormous, horrific fact of enslavement in her world. And so her father appears to have enslaved someone whom he actually gave medical training to, but the man remained enslaved. And actually, the Sisters of Charity and the Sulpicians, the sisters didn't own enslaved labor, but they relied on it. It's clear if you follow the money that even their charitable efforts relied on money that was expropriated from enslaved people. And it's kind of a difficult undercurrent of the Catholic Church in that era, as it's a difficult, crucial undercurrent of the American nation in that era. And it is not something that she attended to that I can see in the documents.
I thought it was interesting how you addressed that that problem of slavery in your book as well. It's not a central focus of the book by any means, and it wasn't a central focus of her life either. But when it's relevant, you definitely take care to bring that into the picture.
Yeah, I certainly felt obligated to do that. I mean, the people who are enslaved are participating in this community, right? They're helping this community do its charitable work, and they needed to be part of the book. And also, just sort of in the air, we have Americans discussing the legacy of slavery, the obligations of slavery, and then Georgetown University, for example, which had a connection to the same community of enslaved people who recently made an effort to discover that history, to make some kind of imperfect reparations. So I thought that should be part of the story.
Well, I thought this was really interesting overall, just because, I mean, Seton's a great figure to focus on in a biography, but just in the way that it was apparent that this is really an interesting way to put together a biography as sort of a window into a time that you talked about earlier. People really don't see these different worlds and these different strains of history set next to each other in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she's involved in Protestantism and Catholicism. She's affected by the French Revolution, by the age of Napoleon. She has lots of unexpected liberties. She has a lot of privilege, and yet she faces real constraints. She suffers from the medical sort of horrors that people of the day suffered from. And not only did she write it down, but people kept it. So it is this kind of wonderful gift of an archive, even, apart from certainly apart from the way she's remembered, right, within a specific faith tradition. This is a person who lived through all of these events and considered these different possibilities, and who is visible to us in a way that's so unusual for any historical figures, and for women. So it was just a wonderful kind of experience to do that research and writing.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to stop, Catherine. Again, the book is Elizabeth Seton, American Saint by Catherine O'Donnell. And thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.